The next section on the seller lead sheet is information about the mortgage or the debt. And this is important for many different reasons. And let me scroll down here. And what I'm going to be focusing on are all the questions in this section right here. So remember, you want to find sellers that have potential properties that you can make a lower offer on, obviously. Well, we want to know if there's any equity in the property. And we're going to run our comparables. In a future course, I'm going to be teaching you how to run comparables if you don't know how already, which many of you do. Um, but we need to get an idea of the debt and whether they're behind on the debt and what that looks like, right? We haven't run title on the property, so we don't know what's out there or what's attached to the property. And although we can remember, this is important because on the property card, we can, in most areas, you can pull a property card, and you're looking at one right now. And on most property cards, it'll have a mortgage history, right, which I'm highlighting right now. So this is financing that has been taken out against a property. And so a lot of times you can find out, when they financed or refinanced or things of that nature. So some sellers are hesitant. This is probably the one area they're the most hesitant to reveal. I would say 80% of the time I can get this information out of from the seller when I'm just talking to them on the phone. But there are a few sellers who aren't going to want to reveal this information or going to, and I'm not going to press them too hard because I know I can find it out other places. And if they're not willing to reveal it, if with a follow-up question they're still not willing to reveal it, I'm not going to press them too hard. I'm going to just move on to the next section and I'll look that up later on. Doesn't mean the deal's dead if they're not willing to reveal the information, but it does tell me a little bit about the seller and the seller's motivation levels. And sometimes the seller is hiding things, right? That they don't want you to know certain things. Okay, so here's what's important. There are a lot of other things that could be filed, leaned up against this property. There could be a mechanics lien from a contractor, right? There could be any there could be an IRS lien. There could be multiple lenders, first mortgage, second mortgage, third mortgage, so on and so forth on this property. There could be just so many different things that you don't expect when title is run that may pop up. I'm going to try to get an indication of what they owe and what the total debt is on the property. And I want to do that before I start getting into price and what the seller might be looking for the property, because I want to know if there's any equity, because I'm always going to assume and try to work from what they owe up. So let's say the property, I'll just give you a scenario. Let's say the property after repair value is $250,000 and it needs $25,000 in work and the current value is $200,000. That's the current market value. If it were fixed up and $25,000 were poured into it, it'd be worth $250,000. Well, if the seller owes $125,000, I'm going to be somewhat assumptive that they might be willing to sell me the property at what they owe plus maybe a little bit of moving money, or not, I don't want to say, what are you looking to sell the property for, Mr. Seller? And he's going to quote something, 200,000 or 180 or something of that nature. I'm always going to want to, once they've given you that number, it's harder to work down, right? And it's more of a combative negotiating position. So I'm going to work up, but I need to first get a snapshot of what's owed against this property. So if I were talking to John, I would say, John, what do you currently owe on the property? And John tells me $125,000. Okay. Now, John had previously, let's assume he had told me that he was a few months behind on the mortgage, or he was in pre-foreclosure and was moving outside of the area, so on and so forth. So he tells me 125. Now, John may just be quoting the first mortgage because a lot of times he may have forgotten that he took out a second mortgage or that there's other debt. So I would ask him, now, John, are there any other mortgages, or is that the total debt? Does that encompass the first and second or third mortgage? No, there's only a first mortgage against the property, right? So maybe John tells me, or he says, well, yeah, I do have a second mortgage. So then I'd rephrase the question. John, so the first mortgage balance is $125,000 and the second mortgage balance is separate. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, okay. So depending on what he says there, I would write it down. So let's assume John says, no, I just have a first mortgage of 125,000. So then I'd ask him, is there any other liens against the property in any capacity? Because you did say you were behind on payments, and sometimes there's other liens. No, there's not any other liens, right? Now, I already know he's not current on payments, so I'd write in no here. I wouldn't ask the question because I already know he's not current. He told me earlier that he was behind. And so I'd ask him, I'd clarify. Now, you said you were 3 months behind, John? Or if I didn't know how many months, I'd say, John, how many months behind are you? And here's what's important to know. If John's more than 3 months behind on the mortgage or on what's owed to the bank, then you have to know there a lot of times that's when the bank starts the foreclosure process is after the third month. And so there could be other amounts owed, right? Because when a bank legally starts a foreclosure process, there are expenses that are incurred. So if his mortgage payment were, let's say, 1,000 a month, if he were 5 months behind, he owes 5,000. So let's say he said his balance was 125. Well, it's probably more than that because you have to factor in the 5 months behind plus any expenses, right, that have been incurred by the bank legally starting the foreclosure process. So I want to try to get that amount behind number. And a lot of times I'm going to add it to the number that he said initially, which was 125. Because remember, he owes 125, but that was when he stopped paying the mortgage more often than not 5 months ago. So he also owes the 5 payments. And so all of that has to be factored in as well. So if he were to tell me that, I would say 125 plus 5, plus I'd probably throw in $2,000 in outside expenses there. And right now I know, okay, he's at about 132, right? Now I'm going to ask him also, now, does your mortgage payment include taxes and insurance? Which most of the time it does. So is PITI rolled in there? And he'll tell me, and I'll ask him, okay, and what is your monthly payment if I haven't already written down or if I don't know the monthly payment? I was assuming earlier I did. So the monthly payment's $1,000 a month. Right, and does that include taxes and insurance? Okay, and what's the interest rate on your mortgage there, right? First mortgage, you might tell me 5.5%. Now, is that fixed or is that adjustable? And you might be wondering, well, why am I getting into this level of detail? I'm going to get into this level of detail if I think there's an opportunity to buy the property subject to the existing mortgage and leave the mortgage in place, right, and take title of the property. Now, remember, you're not assuming the mortgage. Assuming the mortgage is very different. That's where you would actually notify the bank and re-qualify, right, and take over and assume that mortgage. That's a completely different process, right? Subject to is you're taking title and leaving the mortgage in place. Now, there's a lot of things that are outside of the spectrum of this course with a due on sale clause. And technically you're violating the terms of the mortgage, but subject to is a good way of financing properties in certain situations. Now, the seller really has to be motivated for you to want to do that, but this is, remember, that's outside of the spectrum of this course because we're focusing on just taking the lead here. But that's why I'm asking these detailed questions. Now, if you have no intention of of buying that property subject to, you don't need to get into fixed, adjustable, things of that nature. You may want to ask, though, whether the mortgage has a prepayment penalty. And there's going to be a good reason for this because maybe, let's say on this particular deal that, I'll just give you an example. Let's say you weren't willing to pay anything more than $140,000 for this property. Well, if what they owe is greater than that for whatever particular reason, that's your cutoff, right? Well, if what they owe, then they can't sell their. So if they're getting dangerously close to owing what you're willing to pay, you may not know, but there might be a prepayment penalty on this mortgage because they just refinanced and there's a prepayment penalty in place. And so you want to know what the total debt is. That's why we ask these questions so you can get an idea. Okay, what's this seller owe? Because if the seller is motivated, they're generally going to be focused on, okay, well, I'm motivated, I need to get out. A lot of times I know I'm going to sell my property for less than what it's worth. But I just need to know, am I going to be able to pay off a little bit of credit card debt, have enough money for a down payment? They're trying to navigate some of these finances that could be getting a little bit thin based on the situation. So that's why you want to know this information. I'm then going to ask the seller, the mortgage company, the first mortgage company, second mortgage company, right? You may have dealt with that bank in negotiating short sales before. It may help you build rapport with the seller if you're going to do a short sale, because you've dealt with that bank before, and you can, oh, you know what, I've dealt with, Bank of America before, I've dealt with this particular bank before, and I've had success negotiating. So these are all things that are also important when you're building trust and rapport with the seller overall as you're taking the lead. So that's the mortgage information section, and what it's doing is it's pointing to whether or not this seller has any equity based on what you see on the Zestimate versus what the total debt owed. So when I'm done, I'm gonna circle on the lead sheet what I think the total debt is for this property once I've gathered all of this information from the seller.